The salt-laden breeze hit Captain Sarah Mitchell's face as she stepped out of her truck, and for the first time in 7 years, she felt something close to peace. The South Carolina marina was exactly as she remembered it from her childhood: weathered docks stretching into the harbor, seagulls wheeling overhead, the gentle creak of mooring lines swaying in the wind. But everything else about her life had changed fundamentally. Her hands, once soft and unmarked, now bore the calluses and scars of a woman who'd survived things most people couldn't comprehend. Her eyes, which had once sparkled with innocent optimism, now carried the weight of classified operations, the faces of fallen soldiers, and nightmares that visited her at 3 a.m. without fail. Sarah walked slowly down the dock, her athletic frame moving with the controlled precision of someone trained in hand-to-hand combat and tactical operations. At 34 years old, she looked simultaneously younger, because of her athletic build and sharp features, and decades older, thanks to the deep lines around her eyes and the silver streak that had appeared in her dark hair during her 4th deployment. The other boat owners barely glanced at her as she passed. They had no idea who she was, what she'd done, or what it had cost her to get here. Then she saw it. The 42-foot sailboat gleamed in the afternoon sunlight like a promise made flesh. The Meridian, that was her name, painted in elegant script across her hull in gold leaf. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She'd been shown the listing online 3 weeks ago, and she'd spent every night since staring at the photographs on her laptop, hardly daring to believe that this dream might actually be within reach. The boat was a classic 1987 Morgan design, with teak railings worn smooth by decades of hands, a cabin that promised solitude, and a sail rig that looked like it could take you anywhere in the world. Sarah had first fallen in love with sailing at age 8, when her grandfather took her out on a small dinghy in this very harbor. She remembered the feeling of the wind in her face, the freedom of gliding across the water with nothing but skill, and the elements determining your fate. Her grandfather had taught her that the sea respected courage but punished carelessness. That lesson had served her well in special forces. In the mountains of Afghanistan, in the jungles of Central America, in the deserts where her unit conducted operations she still couldn't discuss, the sea's wisdom had kept her alive. But then life had happened. College, military academy, the grueling selection course for special forces that had broken 90% of candidates. Sarah had made the cut. She'd become one of the few women to earn the coveted Green Beret, and she'd spent the last 7 years proving herself to men who'd initially doubted she belonged. Every mission had taken her further from the girl who loved sailing. Every deployment had filled her bank account, while simultaneously emptying something essential from her soul. The nightmare started around year 3. She'd wake up gasping, her heart racing, drenched in sweat, reliving moments she wasn't allowed to discuss with anyone. There was no therapist cleared for top-secret information. There was no real help, just medication and the knowledge that you had to compartmentalize, soldier on, complete the mission. Her fellow operators had become her only family, bound together by shared trauma and the weight of classified secrets that could never be spoken aloud. But now, standing in front of the Meridian, Sarah felt something shifting inside her chest. This boat represented possibility. It represented control. Out on the water, there were no classified operations, no rules of engagement, no body counts. There was just the wind, the waves, and a woman learning to live again. "She's something special, isn't she?" Sarah turned to see an elderly man approaching, his weathered face breaking into a smile. He had the look of someone who'd spent decades on the water, sun-darkened skin, eyes that had learned to read the ocean's moods, hands gnarled from working with ropes and wood. "She's perfect," Sarah whispered. The man extended his hand. "I'm Richard Walsh. I've owned her for 15 years, but my wife, she's got arthritis now, and we just bought a place in Florida. Thought it was time to let someone else give her the love she deserves." They talked for 2 hours. Richard took Sarah aboard, showing her the details with the pride of a man who genuinely loved his boat. The cabin was compact but beautifully finished, with a galley kitchen that could serve a crew, a navigation station equipped with modern electronics, and a sleeping cabin with a porthole that framed the marina perfectly. There was something magical about being below deck, surrounded by the gentle creak of wood and the smell of salt-treated canvas. Sarah could already imagine herself here, reading in the quiet mornings, studying celestial navigation at night, maybe finally writing down some of the things she needed to process. "How much?" Sarah asked, though she'd already seen the listing price online. Richard named a figure and Sarah's heart sank slightly. It was more than she had liquid savings, though not by an impossible amount. She'd been careful with her military pay, never spending on frivolous things, always thinking ahead. This could work. This could actually happen. "I can show you the maintenance records," Richard continued, "and I've had a professional survey done. She's in excellent condition. Sails are relatively new, had those replaced about 3 years ago. Engine runs like a dream. Really, she just needs an owner who loves her and has the time to maintain her properly." Sarah closed her eyes for a moment, and in that darkness she made a decision. 7 years of service, hundreds of missions, countless moments where she'd risked everything. She'd earned this. She deserved this. "I want her," she said quietly. Richard's face broke into a genuine smile. "I thought you might." The paperwork took 2 weeks. Sarah worked with a broker, arranged financing, and submitted to inspection after inspection. Everything checked out perfectly. The boat had no liens, no complications, no hidden problems. It was exactly what it appeared to be, a well-maintained vessel with a clear title and an honest seller. On a gray Tuesday morning, Sarah signed the final documents in the marina office. Her hands were steady. Years of military discipline had taught her to control her emotions. But inside, she was trembling with a joy she'd almost forgotten how to feel. Richard signed beside her, and when the notary stamped the papers, it was official. The Meridian was hers. They shook hands on the dock afterward, and Richard gripped her shoulder with surprising strength for a man his age. "You're going to be happy with her," he said, studying her face with an intensity that made Sarah wonder if he somehow understood the weight she carried. "Some boats are just meant for certain people. I think you two are going to be good for each other." Sarah walked aboard her boat, and stood at the helm, running her fingers across the worn wooden wheel. The sun was breaking through the clouds now, and golden light spilled across the deck. She thought about the deserts, the mountains, the operations that would fade from her memory as the years passed. She thought about the soldiers who'd never come home, whose dreams would never be realized, whose boats would never sail. And then she let herself feel gratitude. 6 months had passed since Sarah Mitchell became the owner of the Meridian, and she'd spent nearly every waking moment restoring her to pristine condition. The boat had been well maintained by Richard, but Sarah had different standards. She wanted perfection. She wanted every board sanded, every fitting polished, every system upgraded. In the military, attention to detail meant the difference between life and death. In her boat, it meant the difference between survival and disaster at sea. More importantly, the work kept her hands busy and her mind focused on something tangible, something she could control. The morning of the incident was beautiful, the kind of South Carolina morning that made tourists visit and locals forget to complain about the heat. Sarah had woken at dawn, as she always did, her body still operating on military time despite her discharge. She'd made strong black coffee, practiced 30 minutes of yoga to manage the chronic pain in her lower back from a parachute landing injury, and changed into her work clothes, faded jeans, a white tank top, and worn boat shoes. By 8 in the morning, she was on the deck of the Meridian with a bucket of soapy water and a soft bristled brush, scrubbing the teak railings. The morning sun warmed her shoulders and she'd put in her earbuds, listening to a podcast about maritime history. This was her happy place, the repetitive work, the salt air, the gentle rocking of the boat at anchor. For the first time since leaving the military, Sarah felt like she could breathe without the weight of classified operations pressing down on her chest. She'd managed to secure a part-time job at a local maritime consulting firm, using her knowledge of naval operations and logistics. It paid enough to live on, with her military pension covering the rest. She had no mortgage, no dependents, no expensive habits. The boat was her only indulgence, but she'd earned it 1,000 times over. Life was finally settling into something resembling normal. At 10:47 a.m., she heard the sound that would change everything. Multiple vehicle engines, moving fast. Not the gentle purr of the small cars that occasionally drove through the marina parking lot, but something heavier, more aggressive. Sarah pulled out her earbuds and stood up, her combat instincts immediately activating. Her eyes narrowed, and her breathing became controlled and shallow, the same physiological response that had served her so well in dangerous situations. 3 black SUVs screeched into the marina parking lot with the coordinated precision of a tactical team executing a raid. Sarah's heart rate elevated. Men in dark suits began emerging from the vehicles, 6 in total, moving with the kind of purposeful confidence that came from federal authority. They wore sunglasses despite the overcast conditions, and their jackets were loose enough to conceal shoulder holsters. Sarah's mind calculated distances and exit routes, old habits that she couldn't shut off even after she'd hung up her uniform. She was alone on the boat. The nearest witness was Marina Manager Tom, who was in his office about 100 yards away. She had maybe 30 seconds before they reached her boat. 2 of the agents broke away from the group and headed directly down the dock toward the Meridian. The lead agent was a man in his 50s with gray temples and the bearing of someone accustomed to being obeyed. The second agent, a woman in her early 40s with a severe expression, carried a manila folder thick with documents. Sarah descended from the boat's railings and stood waiting on the deck, her hands visible, her expression neutral. She'd learned in special forces that the first rule of dealing with law enforcement was never to appear aggressive or defensive. Never give them a reason. "Captain Sarah Mitchell," the lead agent called out, not quite a question. "Yes," Sarah answered, her voice steady. "What can I do for you?" The agents boarded without being invited, moving across the deck with the casual confidence of people who believed they had every right to do so. The lead agent opened his jacket to reveal his credentials, FBI badge and identification. The woman did the same. "I'm Special Agent Morrison, and this is Special Agent Chen," the man said. "We're here regarding the vessel Meridian. We need to speak with you about the circumstances of your purchase." Sarah's stomach tightened, but she kept her face impassive. "Of course, what's this about?" Agent Chen opened the folder and produced several documents. "The Meridian was previously owned by Richard Walsh. Is that correct?" "Yes, I purchased the boat from him 6 months ago. All the paperwork is in order. I have the bill of sale, the title transfer, the certificate of registry." "We're aware of the documentation," Agent Morrison interrupted, his tone suggesting that paperwork meant very little to him. "What we're investigating is the source of funds used in the purchase of this vessel. Mr. Walsh is currently the subject of a federal investigation related to suspected money laundering activities. Specifically, activities that may have occurred prior to your purchase." Sarah felt the world tilt slightly. Money laundering, Richard Walsh, the elderly man with the arthritis and the Florida retirement plans. It seemed impossible. "Agent Morrison, I purchased this boat through a licensed marine broker. I have financing documentation from a legitimate bank. The broker performed all the standard background checks on the vessel. Richard Walsh and I discussed the boat, but we didn't discuss his personal finances. He seemed like a perfectly legitimate seller." "That may be the case," Agent Chen said, her voice carrying a note of sympathy that contradicted the official nature of their visit. "However, we have reason to believe that certain proceeds from criminal activity may have been used to purchase or maintain this vessel. Until we can clear this matter up, I'm afraid we're going to need to impound the Meridian." Sarah felt her composure crack slightly. Impound? You can't. I bought this boat legitimately. I have all the documentation. I'm not involved in whatever Richard Walsh may or may not have done. I understand your frustration, Agent Morrison said, producing another document from the folder. But this is a civil asset forfeiture case. The boat is potentially tied to criminal activity, which means we can seize it pending investigation. You'll have the opportunity to challenge the forfeiture in court and prove that your purchase was made in good faith with legitimate funds. Sarah's mind, trained in military operations and tactical analysis, suddenly grasped the full scope of the problem. Civil asset forfeiture. She'd read about it, cases where the government could seize property without ever proving that the owner had done anything wrong. The burden of proof fell on her. She would have to prove her innocence, not the other way around. This is a mistake, Sarah said quietly, her voice controlled but edged with steel. I'm a decorated military officer. I've held security clearances. I'm not involved in money laundering. Again, we understand, Agent Chen said. She actually sounded sympathetic. This is likely just a formality. It should be cleared up quickly once the investigation concludes. But Sarah could see in their eyes that they didn't believe it would be quick. She watched helplessly as the agents made phone calls, and within 30 minutes, a marine salvage crew arrived to begin the process of impounding her boat. They disconnected the power, secured the vessel, and placed official government seals on the cabin door. Sarah stood on the dock, watching her dream being taken away, and for the first time since her discharge, she felt the familiar weight of helplessness crushing down on her chest. She'd survived combat zones where the enemy was clear and the rules of engagement were defined. But this administrative bureaucracy, this legal machinery grinding forward without regard for her innocence, was something she didn't know how to fight. As the agents drove away, Sarah stood alone on the empty dock, and she whispered words no soldier wanted to speak. What do I do now? The manila envelope arrived at Sarah's apartment 3 days after the seizure, delivered by certified mail. She knew what it was before she even opened it: the official notice from the U.S. Attorney's Office regarding the civil forfeiture case against her vessel, the Meridian. Her hands trembled slightly as she tore open the envelope and began reading the dense legal language that would come to haunt her nightmares for months to come. The government had filed a federal civil action against the boat itself, not against Sarah personally, but against the Meridian as though it were a criminal defendant. The property, the document stated, was subject to forfeiture pursuant to 18 U.S.C. Section 981, which gave the government authority to seize any property that had been used in connection with money laundering or drug trafficking offenses, or any property purchased with proceeds from such crimes. The burden of proof, the document made abundantly clear, rested entirely on Sarah. She would have to prove by a preponderance of the evidence that the funds used to purchase the vessel were legitimate and that she had no knowledge of any criminal activity. The government didn't have to prove anything. They didn't have to demonstrate that Richard Walsh had actually committed a crime. They didn't have to show that the boat had been used in criminal activity. They simply had to assert the possibility, and the burden fell on her to prove otherwise. Sarah sat on her apartment floor for an hour, reading the same paragraphs over and over, unable to fully comprehend the reality of the situation. In the military, there had always been clarity, rules of engagement, chain of command, a logical structure to operations. This was different. This felt like being attacked by something she couldn't see or fight effectively. She called the maritime consulting firm the next morning and took a leave of absence. She'd need to focus on this legal nightmare full-time if she had any hope of resolving it. The financial impact was immediate and brutal. Her already modest monthly income cut in half. She'd have to dip into her savings, which meant less money for living expenses and food, and potentially more for legal fees. Finding an attorney proved more difficult than she expected. The first 2 lawyers she consulted specialized in other areas of law and politely referred her elsewhere. The third lawyer, a grizzled man named David Chen with a cluttered office in a strip mall near downtown, seemed like her best option. He'd handled civil forfeiture cases before, though his tone when discussing them made Sarah's stomach knot with anxiety. She sat across from Chen's desk on a Tuesday afternoon, watching him review the government's forfeiture documents with an expression that grew increasingly grim. He was in his 60s, with wire-rimmed glasses and the bearing of someone who'd been fighting bureaucratic battles for decades. Behind him, his office walls were covered with photographs of himself with clients, awards from legal organizations, and several photographs of boats. "So you love sailing too?" Sarah asked, trying to inject some normalcy into the situation. Chen looked up from the documents and removed his glasses. "I did, before these cases started consuming my life. How long have you owned this boat?" 6 months. "And before that, what's your history with Richard Walsh?" "There is no history. I met him through a marine broker. I saw the listing online, we talked on the phone, I looked at the boat, I liked it, I bought it." Chen sighed heavily and leaned back in his chair. "Captain Mitchell, I'm going to be honest with you because I think you deserve honesty. Civil forfeiture cases are some of the most frustrating and infuriating cases a lawyer can take on. Legally, you're right, you should have nothing to worry about. You purchased the boat with legitimate funds. You've done nothing wrong, you have documentation of everything. But the legal system, unfortunately, doesn't work the way it should in these situations." "What do you mean?" Sarah asked, though part of her already knew the answer. "I mean that the government has essentially put the burden on you to prove a negative. You have to prove that you didn't do anything wrong. You have to prove that the boat wasn't purchased with criminal proceeds. In theory, once you provide documentation proving you bought it with legitimate funds, the case should be over. In practice, civil forfeiture cases drag on indefinitely. The government will request more documentation, file motions to delay, argue procedural issues, and tie up the process for months, sometimes years." Sarah felt her jaw clench. But that's not justice. That's not how the system is supposed to work. "No," Chen agreed, pulling his glasses back on. "It's not, but it's how it does work. And here's the ugly truth that I have to tell you. The government loves civil forfeiture because it's profitable. Every dollar they seize is a dollar that can go into their law enforcement budget. They have a financial incentive to keep these cases going as long as possible because resolved cases don't generate revenue." The words landed like physical blows. Sarah had spent 7 years serving her country, believing in the system, trusting that institutions existed to protect people. Suddenly, she was seeing those same institutions as predatory machines designed to extract resources from citizens. "How long do you think this will take?" Sarah asked quietly. "Honestly, anywhere from 6 months to 2 years, maybe longer if they decide to make it difficult. The key will be whether they actually pursue charges against Richard Walsh. If they do, and if he's convicted, then your case becomes much more complicated. If they don't pursue charges, then you have a stronger argument that the boat itself wasn't involved in any criminal activity." "And what will it cost me in legal fees?" Chen quoted a number that made Sarah's heart sink. It was nearly $30,000, possibly more depending on how aggressive the government decided to be. Sarah did the mental math. Her military pension covered her basic expenses, but it wasn't generous. She had savings, but $30,000 would deplete nearly everything. And that was assuming the case resolved quickly, which Chen had just told her was unlikely. "Captain, there's something else you should know," Chen continued, his voice gentler now. "These cases are designed to be discouraging. The government's strategy is often to make the process so painful and expensive that people give up and accept a settlement offer. They'll offer you 50% of the boat's value back, and they'll present it like they're being generous. What they're really doing is stealing half your property through the legal system." Over the next few months, Sarah learned the true meaning of bureaucratic torture. She submitted documentation. The government requested more documentation. She provided bank statements. They requested the previous 6 months of statements. She provided emails between her and the broker. They requested every email from her personal account for the past year. Each request took hours to compile. Each submission seemed to generate 3 new requests. Court dates were scheduled and then postponed. Motions were filed and rejected on procedural grounds, requiring her to refile them correctly. The legal bills mounted, and Sarah watched her savings account shrink with each passing week. She began to understand why the government's strategy worked. It wasn't about winning in court. It was about exhaustion, about breaking people down through sheer bureaucratic weight until they gave up and accepted whatever deal was offered. At night, Sarah would sit in her apartment, staring at the stack of legal documents and feel something inside her beginning to crack. She'd survived ambushes and explosions and seeing people die in her arms, but this slow, methodical dismantling of her life through the legal system was somehow worse. At least in combat, there was an enemy you could fight. This enemy was invisible and seemingly unstoppable. The federal courthouse was a gray, imposing structure of concrete and glass that seemed designed to intimidate anyone who entered. Sarah had been here 7 times in the past 9 months, and each visit had become progressively more depressing. Today was different, though. Today was the day she finally broke. She sat in the waiting area outside Judge Harold Patterson's chambers, wearing the same navy suit she'd worn to every previous hearing. Her attorney, David Chen, sat beside her, looking like he'd aged 5 years in the 9 months since taking her case. His hair had more gray, his eyes had more lines, and his demeanor had shifted from cautiously optimistic to quietly resigned. "He's going to postpone again," Chen muttered, not bothering to look at Sarah. "I can feel it." "How much longer can they postpone?" Sarah asked, though she already knew the answer. She'd learned too much about civil forfeiture law over the past 9 months, more than she'd ever wanted to know. "Indefinitely," Chen said flatly. "That's the point. The government has no incentive to resolve this quickly. Every month that passes, they're costing you money and wearing you down." Sarah felt something snap inside her chest, not violently, but with a quiet finality, like a cable under tension finally reaching its breaking point. She'd survived ambushes in the Hindu Kush Mountains. She'd carried wounded soldiers across kilometers of desert. She'd made decisions that resulted in the deaths of enemy combatants and, sometimes, in the loss of her own people. She'd endured physical pain, psychological trauma, and the weight of classified operations that would haunt her for the rest of her life. But this incremental, bureaucratic destruction of her life was something different entirely. It was designed to break you not through a single catastrophic blow, but through 1,000 small cuts that bled you dry. "I'm not doing this anymore," Sarah said quietly. Chen turned to look at her, alarm in his eyes. "What do you mean? We have a hearing in." "I mean I'm not playing by their rules anymore," Sarah interrupted. She stood up, straightening her suit jacket. "These people don't work in the light. They operate through secrecy and procedure and bureaucratic obfuscation. If I stay in this system, they'll destroy me. So I'm going to operate differently." "Sarah, I understand your frustration, but we need to stay focused on the legal strategy. Antagonizing the government isn't." "I'm not going to antagonize them," Sarah said. She was already pulling out her phone. "I'm going to expose them." That evening, Sarah did something that would have been unthinkable to her a year ago. She contacted a local news station. She asked for the producer of the evening news program and told her story: the decorated military officer, the legitimate boat purchase, the 9 months of legal hell with no end in sight. The producer sounded interested but cautious. Civil forfeiture was a complex issue, and local news stations didn't always cover legal stories in depth. "Why should our viewers care?" the producer asked. It was a fair question. "Because I served my country for 7 years, Sarah said, her voice steady but carrying the weight of real emotion. "I've held security clearances. I've risked my life. And now my own government is treating me like a criminal based on a previous owner's alleged activities that I had nothing to do with. If they can do this to me, they can do this to anyone." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Sarah could almost hear the producer's calculations, whether this was a story worth pursuing, whether there was a human interest angle that would resonate with viewers. "Send me your documentation," the producer finally said. "Everything you have. The purchase agreement, the title transfer, the bank statements, the legal filings, everything." Sarah spent the next 3 days preparing a comprehensive packet of documents. She included her military discharge papers, her service record, her security clearance documentation. She included photos of herself with the boat, smiling in the way she had before the seizure. She included a written statement detailing the timeline of events and the emotional toll the case had taken on her. 2 weeks later, the story aired. The reporter, a sharp-looking woman named Jennifer Walsh, had done her research thoroughly. The segment opened with footage of Sarah standing on the dock where her boat had been impounded, the Meridian visible in the background, government seals clearly visible on the cabin. Jennifer's voiceover explained the situation in clear, accessible language. How civil forfeiture laws, ostensibly designed to combat drug trafficking and money laundering, had become a tool for the government to seize property from law-abiding citizens with minimal due process. The segment cut to an interview with Sarah, sitting in her apartment, discussing the experience with raw emotion. She didn't hide her frustration or her sense of betrayal. She talked about the legal costs, the psychological toll, the feeling of helplessness. And then Jennifer asked the question that would change everything. "Captain Mitchell, you served your country with honor and now your country has turned against you. How does that feel?" Sarah paused for a long moment before answering. "It feels like a betrayal, but more than that, it makes me realize that if this can happen to me, someone with resources and education, and the ability to fight back, what happens to ordinary people who don't have those advantages? How many people have had their property seized and given up because they couldn't afford a lawyer or navigate the legal system? That's what terrifies me most." The segment aired on a Tuesday evening and was picked up by a regional news network by Wednesday morning. By Thursday, it had been shared thousands of times on social media. Veterans groups started reaching out to Sarah, offering support. A civil rights organization called asking if they could feature her case on their website. Reddit threads about civil forfeiture exploded with thousands of comments, many referencing her story. By Friday, the story had gone national. CNN picked it up. Fox News ran a segment. MSNBC covered the legal implications. Suddenly, Sarah wasn't just a woman fighting for her boat, she was the face of civil forfeiture abuse, a decorated American soldier being destroyed by a system that was supposed to protect her. Her phone rang constantly. Interview requests came from major news outlets. Speaking invitations arrived from veterans organizations and civil rights groups. Reddit threads had spawned the hashtag #JusticeForCaptainMitchell, which began trending across social media platforms. Facebook groups were created dedicated to supporting her case. Sarah's inbox filled with messages from other victims of civil forfeiture, people who'd had their houses seized, their cars impounded, their savings frozen, all without ever being charged with a crime. She read stories that were far worse than hers, cases where families had been destroyed, where small business owners had lost everything, where innocent people had been treated as criminals by a system that had no accountability. For the first time since the seizure, Sarah felt something other than helpless despair. She felt anger, righteous, focused, purposeful anger. The kind of anger that had driven her through Special Forces selection when her body wanted to quit. The kind of anger that had kept her sharp during dangerous operations. She called David Chen. "How does the government respond when cases go public like this?" she asked. Chen was quiet for a long moment. "Usually, they look for ways to make it go away quietly. Public scrutiny is their worst nightmare." Then let's make sure everyone is paying attention, Sarah said grimly. She was done hiding, done playing by the rules of a rigged system. The machinery of injustice had tried to grind her down, but it had missed one crucial fact. Sarah Mitchell was a soldier, and soldiers don't surrender without a fight. The phone call came on a Tuesday morning, exactly 1 week after the national news coverage exploded. Sarah was at her apartment, reviewing emails from supporters and civil rights organizations, when an unfamiliar number appeared on her screen. She almost didn't answer. Her life had become a minefield of unexpected calls, some supportive, others hostile, but something made her pick up. Captain Mitchell. The voice was male, professional, official. This is Assistant U.S. Attorney James Morrison. I'd like to schedule a meeting with you and your legal team regarding your case. Sarah's heart rate elevated. What kind of meeting? Let's just say that your recent media appearances have brought some issues to our attention that we'd like to discuss, Morrison said carefully. Can you come to the Federal Building downtown this Friday at 10 in the morning? Sarah hung up the phone and immediately called David Chen. Her attorney listened to the conversation and then exhaled slowly. This is it, Chen said. The public pressure is working. They want to negotiate. How do you know that? Sarah asked. Because they don't usually call defendants in for meetings, and they especially don't ask if you can bring your legal team. This is damage control. They've realized the case has become a political nightmare, and they want to make it go away quietly. Friday morning arrived with unseasonable cold for South Carolina. Sarah found herself shivering as she walked through downtown toward the Federal Building, even though the temperature was only in the low 60s. David Chen walked beside her, briefcase in hand, his expression carefully neutral. Let me do the talking, Chen advised as they entered the building. Listen to what they offer but don't commit to anything. We'll discuss before responding. The Federal Building was exactly what Sarah expected. Cold, sterile, designed to intimidate. They were directed to an elevator and taken to the 7th floor, where a young paralegal escorted them to a conference room. Inside, 3 men and 1 woman waited. Sarah recognized Assistant U.S. Attorney James Morrison from his official photograph online. The other 3 introduced themselves as representatives from the DEA, the FBI, and the U.S. Attorney's Office. For 10 minutes, they engaged in polite pleasantries. Coffee was offered. Water was poured. Documents were arranged on the table. Sarah sat quietly, observing the prosecutors with the tactical assessment skills she'd honed in 7 years of military service. They were nervous. She could see it in the way they avoided making direct eye contact with her, in the way they shifted in their seats, in the tension in their shoulders. Finally, Morrison cleared his throat and began speaking. Captain Mitchell, we appreciate you coming in today. Your case has received considerable attention in recent weeks, and we believe it's in everyone's interest to reach a resolution. What kind of resolution? Chen asked carefully. The government is prepared to offer a settlement, Morrison continued. We would release 50% of the boat's value to Captain Mitchell immediately. The remaining 50% would be forfeited to the government to cover the costs of investigation and legal proceedings. Sarah felt her hands curl into fists under the table. 50%. They were literally proposing to steal half her property, to profit from her misery, to use the legal system as a tool for theft. That's not a settlement, Sarah said quietly, her voice cutting through the room like a blade. That's theft with legal paperwork. The prosecutors exchanged glances. Morrison cleared his throat. Captain Mitchell, I understand your frustration, but the government's position is. I don't care about the government's position, Sarah interrupted. She stood up, and David Chen made a movement like he was about to pull her back down, but she was already moving. She opened her briefcase and withdrew a folder she'd prepared specifically for this moment. You want to know who I am, Sarah said, her voice sharp and controlled, the voice of someone accustomed to command. You want to know why you should be very careful about how you proceed with this case. She laid her active military identification card on the mahogany table, the one that identified her as a special operations officer with active security clearance. Next to it, she placed her security clearance documentation, top secret SCI, sensitive compartmented information, the kind of clearance that required exhaustive background investigation and polygraph examinations. "I'm still active," Sarah continued, her eyes moving from prosecutor to prosecutor. "I'm still cleared for sensitive operations. The intelligence community still trusts me with classified information. That means someone in this room," she paused deliberately, letting her gaze settle on Morrison, "has to sign off on any legal proceedings that could jeopardize my clearance or my ability to work in sensitive roles." She added letters of recommendation from her commanding officers, including a general who held significant influence in Pentagon politics. She added newspaper articles about her military service, documentation of her deployments, evidence of her contributions to national security operations that she couldn't describe in detail, but that made her value to the government abundantly clear. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Sarah watched Morrison's face pale slightly. The woman from the FBI shifted uncomfortably. The DEA representative was actually looking at his shoes. "Here's what's going to happen," Sarah said, her voice steady and measured. "You're going to drop this case entirely. Not a settlement, not a partial forfeiture, not a compromise. You're going to release my boat immediately, return it to me in the condition it was seized, and issue a formal apology for the error. And you're going to do it quietly, without a press release, without acknowledgement, because if you try to drag this out or fight it, I'm going to make sure that every single step of this case becomes public knowledge." "Captain Mitchell," Morrison began, his voice wavering slightly, "you need to understand." "No," Sarah interrupted, her military authority filling the room. "You need to understand. You've already made a catastrophic mistake by seizing my property without evidence of wrongdoing on my part. You've already created a national incident involving a decorated service member. Now you have a choice. You can quietly fix this mistake, or you can double down and watch as the media tears apart the entire civil forfeiture apparatus with my case as the centerpiece." She stood at the head of the table, looking down at the prosecutors with the bearing of someone who'd conducted operations that these bureaucrats couldn't even comprehend. "I've survived things that would break most people. I've made life-and-death decisions. I've carried wounded soldiers across hostile terrain. What do you think I'm willing to risk to get my boat back?" The silence was absolute. Chen was staring at Sarah with a mixture of admiration and concern. The prosecutors were avoiding eye contact, calculating political fallout, understanding that they'd just been outmaneuvered by someone who operated on a different level entirely. "We'll need to consult with our supervisors," the FBI agent finally said quietly. "You have 24 hours, Sarah replied. "After that, I go back on national television and discuss exactly what happened in this room." She gathered her documents, returned them to her briefcase with deliberate slowness and stood. "Come on, David, we're done here." As they walked toward the door, Morrison called out, "Captain Mitchell, you should know, we were only following procedure." Sarah paused at the doorway and turned back to face him. "So was I, Mr. Morrison. In the military, we call that just following orders. And we learned after World War II that it's not an acceptable excuse for causing harm to innocent people." The elevator doors closed behind them, and Sarah released a breath she didn't know she'd been holding. David Chen was shaking his head in disbelief. "I've never seen anything like that," he said quietly. "What you just did, you just dismantled their entire case with nothing but the truth and confidence." "That's what 7 years in Special Forces teaches you," Sarah replied. "The truth is always your most powerful weapon. You just have to be willing to use it." Waiting was excruciating. Sarah returned to her apartment and tried to occupy herself with mundane tasks, dishes, laundry, reorganizing her bookshelf. But her mind was elsewhere, running tactical assessments and calculating probabilities the way it had during dangerous military operations. She'd made her move, laid out her cards, and now she had to wait for the other side to respond. In warfare, this period was called the fog of uncertainty, and Sarah had learned to hate it. David Chen called that evening. "Don't be surprised if nothing happens for a few days," he advised. "The prosecutors will need to escalate this to their superiors. You've essentially challenged them on their home turf, and they'll need authorization to back down." "How long?" Sarah asked. "Could be anywhere from overnight to a week. The fact that you involved active security clearances and military operations changed the game completely. Now they're not just fighting you, they're fighting the Department of Defense, the intelligence community, and anyone who doesn't want classified operations compromised by a federal lawsuit against a military officer." Sarah understood what Chen was saying. By invoking her security clearance and her active military status, she'd introduced variables into the equation that the prosecutors couldn't control. If the case proceeded, and Sarah's clearance was somehow jeopardized, intelligence officials would be forced to intervene. If her military service became part of public court testimony, classified information might be exposed. The prosecutors had thought they were dealing with a simple property seizure case. They'd suddenly realized they were holding a political grenade. The next 48 hours were some of the longest of Sarah's life. She obsessively checked her email and phone. She scrolled through news sites, searching for any mention of her case. She called Chen twice, and he told her both times to wait. "They're working behind the scenes," he assured her. "These things take time." On the afternoon of the third day, Morrison called personally. "Captain Mitchell," he said without preamble, "the U.S. Attorney's Office has decided to dismiss all charges against the Meridian and release the vessel immediately." Sarah's knees went weak and she had to sit down. "Just like that." "Just like that," Morrison confirmed. His voice carried no emotion, but Sarah could hear the resignation underneath. "We'll have the paperwork prepared by tomorrow morning. Your attorney can collect the keys from the marina manager by noon." "What about a public statement?" Sarah asked. "There will be no press release from our office," Morrison said carefully. "We'll issue a standard court filing closing the case. That's all. I trust that meets with your understanding." Sarah understood exactly what he was saying. They wanted to disappear this case, to make it as invisible as possible, to prevent it from becoming a symbol of governmental overreach. A press release acknowledging their error would amplify the damage to their credibility. A quiet dismissal allowed everyone to move on and pretend it had never happened. "That's acceptable," Sarah said. She hung up the phone and sat in silence for a long moment, unable to process the reality that the nightmare was actually over. 9 months of legal hell, 9 months of accumulated legal bills, 9 months of her life stolen by a system designed to destroy her. And it had ended not in a courtroom, but in a government conference room when she'd reminded them who they were actually dealing with. The next morning, Sarah met David Chen at his office. He was smiling, genuinely smiling for the first time since they'd met. "You did it," he said, shaking his head in amazement. "I've been handling civil forfeiture cases for 15 years, and I've never seen one end this quickly once it reached the federal level. You understand what you did, don't you?" "I showed them the truth," Sarah replied. "I showed them that I wasn't just a civilian they could bully. I showed them that attacking me had consequences they couldn't control." "You did more than that," Chen said. "You exposed the fundamental injustice of the entire system. They could dismiss your case quietly, but now there's a precedent. The next person they try to use civil forfeiture against can point to your case and ask why their property wasn't returned immediately. You've created a dangerous precedent for them, the idea that these seizures might actually be challenged effectively." By afternoon, Sarah was standing at the marina office with the keys to the Meridian in her hand. The government seals had been removed from the cabin doors. She boarded her boat for the first time in 9 months, and the emotional impact nearly overwhelmed her. Everything was exactly as she'd left it. The restoration work she'd been doing, the coffee mug she'd left on the galley counter, even the book she'd been reading sitting on the cabin bunk. The government had seized it, but they hadn't disturbed it. It was like stepping back into her life from 9 months earlier, as though the nightmare had been nothing more than a prolonged hallucination. Sarah spent the evening on the boat, sitting in the cockpit, watching the sunset paint the water gold and orange. She felt something shifting inside her, a weight lifting, but also something harder taking its place. The military had taught her that the world was complex, that institutions weren't always just, that sometimes you had to fight for what was right. But she'd thought the American legal system was different. She'd thought there were safeguards, checks and balances, procedures designed to protect innocent people. Now she knew better. The system could be weaponized against ordinary citizens. It could be used as a tool of theft dressed up in legal language. And the only reason she'd survived intact was because she'd had resources, education, and military credentials that made her valuable to powerful people. What about everyone else? The question haunted her as darkness fell over the marina. Somewhere in South Carolina, there were people whose cars had been seized by civil forfeiture. Somewhere, there were people whose savings had been frozen. Somewhere, there were ordinary citizens being destroyed by a system designed to benefit government agencies, and nobody was fighting for them. Sarah made a decision that night, sitting alone on her restored boat, looking out at the dark water. She wasn't going to disappear into her peaceful retirement. She wasn't going to sail off into the sunset and pretend that what had happened to her was an isolated incident. She was going to use everything she'd learned, about the system, about herself, about what it took to fight back, to help other people facing the same nightmare she'd endured. The Meridian had been her escape from the military. Now it would become her base of operations for a different kind of mission entirely, a war against injustice fought not with weapons, but with truth, determination, and the refusal to accept that the system was too powerful to challenge. Sarah looked at the stars reflecting off the water and smiled for the first time in months. She'd survived 9 months of bureaucratic hell, and she'd emerged not broken, but transformed. She wasn't just a woman who'd reclaimed her boat. She was a warrior ready for a new battle, one that might prove to be her most important yet. The official court filing arrived on a Thursday morning, a single page of legal language that formally dismissed the government's case against the Meridian and released all claims to the vessel. For a document that represented the culmination of 9 months of legal warfare, it was remarkably sparse. No explanation, no acknowledgement of error, no justification for why the seizure had occurred in the first place. It was the bureaucratic equivalent of pretending nothing had happened. David Chen called Sarah immediately after receiving the filing. "It's over," he said simply. "The court has accepted the dismissal. The boat is yours free and clear. Legally speaking, this case no longer exists." Sarah read the filing 3 times, unable to fully believe that 9 months of nightmare could be condensed into such a brief legal document. But the evidence was undeniable. The case number that had haunted her since the seizure was closed. The property, her boat, her dream, her sanctuary, was legally and completely her own. "What happens now?" Sarah asked Chen. "Do they file an appeal? Do they try to refile under different charges?" "They could theoretically do either," Chen replied, "but they won't. Not in this case. You've made it too politically toxic. Any attempt to refight this would only amplify the media coverage and the perception that they're harassing a decorated military officer. They're hoping everyone forgets about this case and moves on. Your best strategy is to let them have that." But Sarah had no intention of letting anyone forget. While the prosecutors were trying to bury the case, she was busy ensuring it became a symbol of governmental overreach. She contacted Jennifer Walsh, the reporter who'd originally covered her story. Within hours, Walsh had filed a new piece, "Federal Case Against Decorated Service Member Quietly Dismissed." The article detailed the abrupt end to the forfeiture case, noted that the government provided no explanation for the dismissal, and quoted civil rights advocates who suggested the decision reflected the weakness of the government's original claim. The story was picked up by national media outlets again. CNN ran a segment discussing civil forfeiture and how Sarah's case demonstrated the potential for abuse. MSNBC covered the dismissal as a victory for due process rights. Reddit threads erupted with thousands of comments praising Sarah's willingness to fight back. Her social media followers swelled into the tens of thousands. But the most significant response came from somewhere Sarah hadn't anticipated. Other victims of civil forfeiture began contacting her directly. Email after email arrived in her inbox. A woman in Florida whose car had been seized at a traffic stop even though she'd been driving legally. A small business owner in Texas whose bank accounts had been frozen for months based on suspicious activity reports that turned out to be routine transactions. A man in North Carolina whose house had been seized because his son, living in a different state, had been arrested for drug possession, despite the father having no involvement in any criminal activity whatsoever. Each story was more heartbreaking than the last. Each person described the same experience Sarah had endured: the helplessness, the legal costs, the way the system seemed designed to crush them through bureaucratic weight rather than actual justice. And most of these people, Sarah realized, didn't have her resources. They didn't have military credentials or security clearances. They didn't have lawyers willing to take on the government. They'd simply given up and accepted whatever settlement the government offered. Sarah scheduled a meeting with a civil rights attorney named Marcus Washington, a man in his 50s who'd spent 20 years fighting government overreach. They met at a coffee shop near the courthouse, and Sarah laid out her idea. "I want to help people," she said simply. "I want to create some kind of organization that helps victims of civil forfeiture. I'm not a lawyer, so I can't provide legal representation, but I can help connect people with resources, coordinate media attention, and apply public pressure to cases that deserve it." Washington listened carefully, occasionally asking clarifying questions, and when she finished, he leaned back in his chair and smiled. "You understand what you're proposing, don't you? You're going to make enemies. The government agencies involved in civil forfeiture, the DEA, the FBI, local police departments, they benefit financially from these seizures. You'll be threatening their budgets." "I understand," Sarah said. "I've already made enemies with the federal government. What's a few more?" Washington laughed, a genuine belly laugh that attracted curious looks from other coffee shop patrons. "I like you, Captain. You've got the kind of fearlessness that actually makes a difference. All right, I'll help you set this up. We'll create a nonprofit, call it the Forfeiture Defense Project. You'll be the executive director. We'll partner with local legal aid organizations to provide representation or at least basic guidance to people facing seizure cases. And we'll use media attention strategically to put pressure on cases that deserve it." Over the next few weeks, the infrastructure came together with surprising speed. Washington handled the nonprofit paperwork. Sarah spent her days reaching out to civil rights organizations, legal aid societies, and media contacts. Within 2 months, the Forfeiture Defense Project was officially registered, tax-exempt, and ready to begin operations. The first case Sarah took on was the Florida woman whose car had been seized. Her name was Michelle Torres, and she'd been driving to a job interview when a police officer pulled her over for a broken taillight. During the traffic stop, the officer claimed he'd seen something suspicious in her vehicle, and based on that claim alone, he'd seized her car under civil forfeiture laws. Michelle had been fighting for 8 months to get her vehicle back, the same amount of time Sarah had been fighting for her boat. Sarah connected Michelle with a pro bono attorney, but more importantly, she made sure the case received media attention. She appeared on local news stations discussing civil forfeiture and Michelle's specific situation. She organized a protest at the police department headquarters. She coordinated with civil rights organizations to amplify the message. Within 2 weeks, the city announced that it would return Michelle's car and issue an official apology for the wrongful seizure. The victory was intoxicating, not because it benefited Sarah personally, but because it demonstrated that public pressure and media attention could actually work. It could force government agencies to reverse course, to admit error, to do the right thing. Over the following months, the Forfeiture Defense Project expanded its reach. Sarah began receiving speaking invitations from universities, civic organizations, and veterans groups. She was interviewed by major news outlets about civil forfeiture and the need for reform. Her story became a rallying point for a growing movement of people demanding changes to the laws that made seizure possible. But perhaps most significantly, Sarah had found her purpose. The boat that had originally been intended as an escape from her military service had become the base for a new mission, not one fought with weapons and tactics, but with truth, determination, and the power of an individual willing to refuse silence. Standing on the deck of the Meridian one evening, Sarah reflected on how much her life had changed in a year. The peaceful retirement she'd imagined had transformed into something far more meaningful. She wasn't running from her past anymore. She was using everything she'd learned, discipline, courage, strategic thinking, to fight for something that actually mattered. The government had tried to take her boat and break her spirit. Instead, they'd inadvertently created a warrior with a new battlefield and a mission that would outlast them all. The sun was rising over the Atlantic Ocean, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose, as Sarah stood at the helm of the Meridian and released the mooring lines. It was a moment she'd imagined countless times during the 9 months her boat had been impounded. The moment when she would finally take her fully restored vessel out into open water and sail toward the horizon that represented freedom. 1 year had passed since the government dropped its case against her boat. 1 year since she'd stood in that federal conference room and refused to accept injustice. The Meridian was now completely restored, every board sanded and sealed, every fitting polished to gleaming perfection, every system upgraded and tested. Sarah had spent countless hours working on the restoration, pouring her energy into bringing her dream back to life. But this maiden voyage wasn't just about personal fulfillment anymore. Below deck, the cabin had been converted into a floating office. There were filing cabinets containing case files from the Forfeiture Defense Project. There was a satellite internet system that allowed Sarah to work from anywhere on the coast. There were photographs of the people she'd helped. Michelle tours with her car, a Texas business owner holding the keys to his house that had been returned to him, a North Carolina father and son reunited after a year of legal separation caused by wrongful seizure. The Meridian had transformed from a personal sanctuary into something far more powerful, a symbol of resistance and a mobile headquarters for a movement. As the boat cut through the morning swells, heading south along the coast toward Savannah, Sarah allowed herself to reflect on the journey that had brought her here. She'd entered the military as a young woman eager to serve her country. She'd emerged as a decorated soldier scarred by experiences she could never fully discuss. She'd sought peace on this boat, and instead had found a new kind of purpose, one that might prove to be her most important contribution yet. The Forfeiture Defense Project had grown beyond her wildest expectations. What had started as Sarah trying to help a handful of people had evolved into a national organization with chapters in 12 states. Volunteer attorneys from law firms donated time to represent clients. Law schools partnered with the organization to give students real-world experience in civil rights cases. Media organizations had begun covering civil forfeiture stories with increased scrutiny, recognizing the pattern of abuse that Sarah's case had highlighted. Congress had taken notice as well. A bipartisan coalition of representatives, moved by stories like Sarah's, had begun drafting legislation to reform civil forfeiture laws. The proposed reforms included higher standards of proof for seizure, mandatory compensation for victims of wrongful seizure, and requirements that seized property be returned within a specific time frame. The legislation was being called the Mitchell Act after Sarah, a fact that still seemed surreal to her. More importantly, the number of successful challenges to civil forfeiture cases had skyrocketed. Where previously, most cases ended with owners accepting partial settlements, now a significant percentage were being completely dismissed or reversed. Sarah's willingness to fight, combined with the legal infrastructure and media attention the Forfeiture Defense Project provided, had changed the equation. Government agencies could no longer rely on the assumption that property owners would simply give up. The impact was being felt at the local level as well. Several police departments had voluntarily ended participation in civil forfeiture programs, recognizing that the negative publicity and legal challenges made seizures more trouble than they were worth. Other departments, facing public scrutiny and legal pressure, had implemented stricter standards for seizures, ensuring that property was only taken when there was clear evidence of criminal activity. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text message from Marcus Washington, the civil rights attorney who'd helped her establish the Forfeiture Defense Project. Just heard from Senator Mitchell's office. The bill is moving out of committee next week. Your testimony before Congress is officially scheduled for the 18th. You ready to change the world? Sarah smiled and typed back, ready. She'd testified before Congress a month earlier, describing her experience with civil forfeiture in terms that no legislator could ignore. She brought photographs of the impounded Meridian, documentation of her legitimate purchase and military service, and most importantly, she'd brought the stories of other victims, people who'd contacted her after her case went public, people whose lives had been devastated by a system designed to generate revenue rather than achieve justice. The legislators had listened, and more than that, they'd acted. The Mitchell Act had moved through committee with unexpected speed, supported by both Democrats and Republicans who recognized civil forfeiture reform as a rare area of genuine bipartisan agreement. As the Meridian sailed south, Sarah received email after email from people whose cases had been resolved with her organization's assistance. A woman in Louisiana whose business had been seized after a completely innocent bank deposit flagged by an automated system, now returned and compensated. A young man in Michigan who'd been pulled over during a traffic stop and had $8,000 in cash seized, cash he'd been withdrawing to buy a car, now fighting back and winning his case with the Forfeiture Defense Project's help. These weren't isolated incidents anymore. These were thousands of people whose lives were being restored because one woman had decided to fight back. But the victory that meant the most to Sarah came from an unexpected source. Richard Walsh, the elderly boat seller who'd originally sold her the Meridian, reached out to her through an intermediary. He'd been dealing with the guilt of what had happened to her, feeling responsible for her suffering even though he'd done nothing wrong. The intermediary explained that Richard wanted to make a donation to the Forfeiture Defense Project in Sarah's name, a significant donation that would fund legal representation for people who couldn't afford it. Sarah called Richard personally, and they talked for nearly an hour. He explained that he'd never been charged with any crime related to money laundering. The government's suspicion had been unfounded from the beginning. He'd been relieved when the case against Sarah was dismissed because he knew it meant his name had been cleared as well. But the experience had shaken him profoundly, making him realize how fragile the protection of property rights actually was in America. "I want to help you fight this," Richard had told her. "I want to make sure what happened to you doesn't happen to anyone else." As Sarah sailed past the Georgia coastline, watching dolphins leap alongside the Meridian, she felt a profound sense of peace mixed with purposeful determination. She'd wanted this boat to be her escape, her sanctuary, her retreat from a world that had demanded too much of her. And in a way, it still was. But it had become something more. A vessel for justice, a symbol of one woman's refusal to accept injustice, and a floating reminder that sometimes the most powerful weapon against institutional corruption is simply the courage to say no. The government had tried to seize her boat and destroy her through bureaucratic processes designed to be overwhelming. Instead, they'd inadvertently created something far more dangerous, a focused, determined advocate for change armed with resources, credibility, and the support of thousands of people who'd experienced the same injustice. Sarah adjusted the sails, catching the afternoon wind, and pointed the Meridian toward her next destination. There were cases waiting, people who needed help, a system that needed to be reformed. The war she'd fought in foreign lands was behind her. This new war, fought not with weapons but with truth, determination, and the power of persistent resistance, was just beginning. As the sun began to set over the Atlantic, painting the water in brilliant shades of gold and crimson, Sarah smiled. She'd finally found what she'd been looking for all along. A mission that mattered, a purpose that transcended personal survival, and the knowledge that sometimes one person's refusal to accept injustice can change the world. The Meridian sailed onward into the gathering darkness, carrying with her a warrior who'd learned that the real battle isn't fought with weapons. It's fought with words, with courage, with the determination to expose truth, and with the absolute refusal to ever again accept that the system is too powerful to challenge. And somewhere along the coast, other people fighting their own battles against bureaucratic injustice would hear Sarah's story and find hope. They would understand that victory was possible, that the system could be beaten, and that sometimes all it takes is one person brave enough to stand up and say, "No, not anymore. Not to me and not to anyone else." The warrior had found her purpose, and the mission would continue, voyage after voyage, case after case, until the system that had tried to destroy her was finally transformed into something that actually served justice instead of institutional profit.